The door was cracked just enough to let warm light spill onto the wet pavement, and I remember the weight of a small bag cutting into my wrist as I stood there, frozen, listening to a life rearrange itself without me. The air smelled like rain and old wood, and everything inside me went still in a way I had never felt before. In that quiet, I understood my marriage had already ended, even though I was still standing outside it. If you've ever trusted someone completely and felt the ground shift beneath you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this unfold in silence every day. I didn't cry or move or interrupt what I was overhearing. I just let the truth settle into my chest, heavy and undeniable. What broke me wasn't anger. It was clarity. The sudden knowledge that love had been happening somewhere else while I was holding everything together. I had no idea then how much that moment would cost me or how far back I would have to go to understand how I ended up there. I was standing outside a familiar place at 7:15 p.m., holding a small bag that suddenly felt heavier than it should. The air was cool, the kind that makes you pause before opening a door. I was 36 years old, married for 10 years, and in that stillness, I understood something had already ended. I had dressed carefully that evening, not for attention, but for memory. I remember thinking how quiet everything felt, how the city hummed without noticing me. Then a sound reached me through a cracked doorway, not shouting, not drama, just certainty that did not include me. In one breath, the shape of my life collapsed. I did not cry. I did not step forward. I stayed where I was and felt the weight of a truth settle into my chest. The marriage I protected no longer existed in the way I believed it did. What broke me was not anger. It was clarity. The sudden understanding that love had been happening somewhere else while I was standing still. Before I explain how I arrived, I did not grow up believing I would disappear inside someone else's life. I was raised in a quiet Midwestern town where work was respected and promises meant something. My parents were steady people, not perfect, but consistent, and they taught me early that independence was not coldness, it was responsibility. By my mid-20s, I was already building a career that demanded focus and discipline. I liked earning my own way. I liked knowing I could stand on my own feet. I believed love should add to a life, not replace it. When I met Daniel, he felt thoughtful and searching, full of ideas but short on stability. I saw potential where others saw risk, and I chose patience without feeling heroic about it. Our marriage began with hope, not sacrifice. I believed in partnership, in growing together, in weathering hard seasons side by side. There were signs even then, small moments where I carried more weight, made more room, stayed quieter than I needed to be. I noticed them, but I did not name them as warnings. I told myself this was what commitment looked like. My deepest flaw was simple. I believed love meant endurance. I believed if I stayed steady enough, gave enough, waited long enough, everything would eventually balance out. I did not yet understand how easily care can turn into obligation, or how slowly responsibility can become invisible. That shift did not happen all at once. It crept in, quietly, while I was still convinced I was choosing it, and I trusted myself completely. Support did not arrive in my marriage as a demand. It arrived quietly, disguised as care. At first it was small things, the kind no one questions. I handled paperwork because I was organized. I paid a bill because I was already at my desk. I made a call because I was better at explaining details. Over time, those favors stacked up. I became the one who remembered deadlines, managed schedules, smoothed tensions, and absorbed emergencies. When work ran late, I adjusted. when stress followed him home. I carried it. I told myself this was partnership, that love sometimes meant stepping forward when someone else stepped back. Then his family entered the rhythm. His mother's needs became constant, his sister's requests more urgent. Appointments, tuition gaps, shortfalls that always needed immediate attention. I filled the spaces without discussion, not because I was asked, but because silence felt easier than resistance. Dependence settled in gently, like dust. What I did not notice at first was how invisible I was becoming. The more reliable I became, the less visible my effort felt. Support turned into expectation. Gratitude faded into assumption. I was no longer seen as a partner, but as a system that simply worked. I understand this now. I was infrastructure, the wiring behind the walls, essential, unnoticed, only acknowledged if something failed. My value lived in how smoothly everything ran, not in who I was. By the time I felt tired, I had already trained everyone to rely on me. Rest felt selfish. Saying no felt cruel. I moved through my days, efficient and composed, while something quieter thinned inside me. I did not yet know it, but that invisibility was creating the space where betrayal could grow. I was present everywhere except with myself, mistaking endurance for devotion, mistaking exhaustion for love, unaware that carrying everything alone would eventually make me disappear, even to the person beside me. Entirely. I stayed where I was, just outside the door, the city noise fading until all I could hear was his voice. It was calm, assured, the same tone he used when he believed himself to be right. I listened, not because I wanted to, but because something in me needed to understand. What I heard did not sound like an affair at first. It sounded like justification. I recognized myself in his description, but distorted. I was suddenly the woman who cared too much about work, who measured life in schedules and numbers, who made him feel confined. In his version, my steadiness had become control. My support had become pressure. There was another presence in the room, lighter somehow. I could hear it in the way his tone softened, in the pauses that felt careful instead of tired. Whoever she was, she sounded unsure, almost apologetic, and he sounded certain. He sounded needed. I realized then that I had not been replaced by passion, but by permission. Standing there, I felt something shift. For years, I had believed that carrying weight was the same as being supportive, listening to him. I finally understood the difference. He did not feel helped. He felt entitled. He had grown comfortable inside the structure I built, and now he was blaming the walls for existing. I did not interrupt. I did not step inside. I stayed very still and let the truth finish forming. The betrayal was real, but what settled deepest was something else. I was no longer confused. I was awake, and as I stood there, I sensed this was only the first layer, that what I had just heard was not the worst of it, only the beginning. The silence around me felt heavy, deliberate, and impossible to misunderstand anymore. I stayed in that narrow space a moment longer, letting what I had heard settle. Then a different recognition surfaced, colder and sharper. I knew the woman he was with, not personally, not socially, but unmistakably. I had approved her scholarship months earlier, read her application, believed in her future. I remembered the pride I felt signing off on that support, thinking I was helping someone build a life. That memory landed like weight. The kindness I had offered was now sitting beside him, benefiting from the same account that paid our bills. In that instant, small details I had dismissed began aligning. The unfamiliar charges, weekend expenses that never quite made sense, withdrawals too minor to question but too frequent to ignore. I did not feel angry yet. I felt embarrassed by my own thoroughness everywhere except my marriage. I was someone trained to notice patterns, to track movement, to ask where things connected. And yet, I had chosen not to look too closely at home. As I stood there, the story rearranged itself. This was not impulse. It was sustained, planned, enabled. My generosity had become part of the structure holding their secret together. That realization burned quietly, not with fury, but with precision. Something in me hardened then, not defensively, but strategically. I stopped listening for emotion and started listening for facts. I knew better than to rush in without understanding the full shape of what I was standing inside. I took one steady breath and made a decision I did not announce. I would not react. I would observe. I would document. Whatever happened next would be guided by clarity, not shock. The moment for confrontation would come, but it would arrive on my terms. That certainty steadied me in the space between action and truth. When I finally stepped inside, I did it without urgency. My body was steady, my breath even. I remember noticing how calm I felt, how different that was from the chaos I had imagined all those years I feared this moment. There was no surge of anger pushing me forward, only clarity. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to fill the silence. I let the stillness speak first. In that quiet, I could see the imbalance clearly, the contrast between how much I had carried and how little truth had been offered in return. I felt no need to defend myself. Facts do not require defense. Inside my mind, I separated truth from excuse. What I had overheard was not confusion or weakness. It was choice. And choices have consequences. I understood then that this marriage could not be repaired because it was no longer mutual. It was supported on one side and consumed on the other. I made my decision without announcing it aloud. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of ending what had already dissolved. Tonight, I would stop providing structure, safety, and silence, not as punishment, but as separation. Support without respect is not love, it is labor. I felt the shift happen internally, like a door closing with precision instead of force. The woman who waited, who explained, who absorbed discomfort, stepped back. In her place stood someone who no longer needed agreement to act. As I turned away, I knew this was not an emotional reaction that could be undone with apologies. It was final because it was factual. I did not look for reassurance or regret. I simply walked out of the space I had been holding together for years, knowing others would soon arrive, drawn by the absence I left behind. The confrontation had already ended. What came next would not be private. I had barely taken a step away when I sensed movement behind me. His family arrived as if on cue, their presence practiced, unhurried, and strangely confident. I watched them take in the scene with familiarity, not surprise. That was the first thing that unsettled me. No confusion, no shock, just irritation, as though I had disrupted a plan. I studied their expressions quietly. His mother's composure carried expectation, not concern. His sister's posture held annoyance, not curiosity. In their eyes, I was not a woman processing betrayal. I was an inconvenience, a problem disrupting comfort. That was when I realized this moment had been discussed long before I arrived. As they reacted, I felt the truth settle into place. This was not a lapse or a secret kept poorly. It was a narrative they had rehearsed, one where my role had already been assigned. I was the cold one, the controlling one, the obstacle to his happiness. Their certainty made it clear that justification had been built around my absence, not my presence. Inside my mind, numbers replaced noise. I saw the gap between what he earned and what they consumed, the difference between values spoken aloud and values funded quietly. Their moral language floated easily because someone else had been carrying the weight. The anger I expected never arrived. Instead, something steadier took hold. Resolution. I stopped needing their understanding. I stopped measuring myself against their version of events. What stood in front of me was not betrayal by one person, but entitlement shared across a family. As I stepped back emotionally, I understood this had never been an isolated mistake. It was a system that depended on my silence. And systems only survive when someone keeps them running. I had already decided to stop. What came next would not involve confrontation. It would involve procedure, boundaries, and action taken quietly, without negotiation. After I left, I did not go home. I drove without music, letting the quiet settle around me instead of replaying every detail. I was not numb. I was focused. Emotion had done its work. Now it was time for order. That night, I made decisions the way I always had at work, calmly and without drama. I froze secondary access to shared accounts, not as retaliation, but as separation. I contacted property management to pause services at the house that was legally mine. No explanations, no speeches, just procedure. I withdrew company funding from projects tied to my name, following clauses that had always been there. Ethics mattered. Structure mattered. I removed myself as guarantor from obligations that were never meant to be permanent. I did not touch healthcare or necessities. I left choices intact and responsibility where it belonged. What surprised me most was how steady I felt. Revenge is loud. Boundaries are quiet. One demands reaction. The other simply changes reality. I was not destroying anything. I was stepping out of roles I had slowly absorbed without consent. Later, alone in a space I had once bought for rest, I felt something unfamiliar settle in. Relief. Not happiness yet, but clarity. The sense that I had finally stopped negotiating with facts. As I prepared for the days ahead, my thoughts turned to the only people who had never asked me to disappear. My children. Their voices, their trust, their honesty would soon matter more than any argument I had just left behind. They anchored me completely forward. Morning came softly. I picked the kids up earlier than usual, watching them run toward me with backpacks bouncing, faces open and unguarded. In that moment, everything narrowed to them. Not the marriage, not the fallout, just the quiet truth of who mattered. Children notice more than we think. They feel tension like weather. I had believed providing stability meant covering bills, smoothing disruptions, keeping life comfortable, sitting with them. I understood how incomplete that belief was. Financial safety does not equal emotional safety. As we shared ice cream by the water, their small observations surfaced without drama. They noticed raised voices. They noticed fear. They noticed smiles that disappeared at home. Listening to what they had already absorbed was harder than any betrayal I had faced. Guilt arrived then, heavy and deserved. I had protected them materially while leaving them inside an environment that asked them to shrink. I had mistaken endurance for strength and called it love. Seeing the clarity in their eyes forced me to see my own blind spots. But guilt did not paralyze me. It redirected me. My role was no longer to hold everything together at any cost. My role was to create a home where calm was normal and honesty did not feel dangerous. I knelt in front of them and promised myself something I would not negotiate again. No more yelling. No more fear disguised as normal. No more silence in the name of peace. They did not need explanations or grand gestures. They needed consistency. They needed safety. In choosing clarity for myself, I was choosing it for them too, and that made every decision ahead feel necessary, not cruel. What others would experience next was consequence. What my children would experience was protection. That promise became my anchor going forward. Time passed without announcement. Weeks turned into months, and I did not follow the details closely. I did not need to. Without my involvement, his world grew smaller on its own. Work became uncertain once funding disappeared. Projects stalled. Explanations replaced plans. The confidence he once wore easily began to thin under ordinary pressure. Family needs that had always been managed quietly now required attention, decisions, and limits he had never practiced. The woman who once felt inspired by rescue did not stay long once responsibility arrived. Affection built on escape does not survive structure. When bills and consequences entered the room, the romance faded without drama. I heard none of this directly. I noticed it only in fragments, through necessary paperwork, neutral updates, and silence where requests used to live. I did not step in. I did not soften outcomes. I let reality speak in its own language. My life moved in the opposite direction. Mornings grew quieter. Evenings slowed. My children settled into routines without tension hovering in the air. Peace arrived not as celebration, but as normalcy. Watching consequences unfold without my participation taught me something simple. When you stop rescuing people, life stops negotiating. Nothing I stepped away from collapsed because of me. It simply stood on its own for the first time. And that distance. I do not tell this story to prove strength. I tell it because clarity changed my life more than anger ever could. For a long time, I believed love was measured by how much I could endure, how quietly I could carry weight without complaint. I thought disappearing was the price of keeping peace. What I learned instead was simple and difficult. Love that requires self-erasure is not love, it is labor. And when people call you cold for setting boundaries, what they often mean is that you stopped being useful to them. Today, my life is smaller in ways that matter and larger in ways that heal. My home is calm. My decisions feel honest. I trust myself again, not because everything is perfect, but because it is mine. Boundaries did not punish anyone. They clarified reality. Walking away did not mean I failed. It meant I stopped lying to myself. It meant I chose truth over familiarity, stability over performance, peace over permission. That choice did not destroy a family. It stopped funding a version of love that was never mutual. If you are watching this and carrying everyone, paying, fixing, smoothing, apologizing just to keep things together, pause for a moment. Ask yourself whether they are holding your hand or holding your resources. Ask what peace is costing you. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If any part of it resonated, take a moment to like the video so it can reach someone who needs it. And if you feel ready, share your experience or the boundary you wish you had set sooner in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude always.